over 50 million civilians lost their lives. In today's world, we fight to uphold these rights because the alternative is unthinkable. We must remember the lessons that we've learned through our shared history as a human race. We must understand that any risk involved with retaining these rights is well worth it, for without these rights, we cannot defend ourselves in the face of tyranny. Joining me tonight to talk about defending ourselves against such tyranny, two very special guests, George Lyon, who is Washington, D.C.'s premier Second Amendment attorney, and Gregory T. Angelo, president of the Log Cabin Republicans. Thank you both for being here and joining me tonight.
My pleasure, Tyler. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Tyler.
Of course, and real quick before we get into the questions here, I just want to thank my friend Jessie Bennett for writing that wonderful intro for me. She's a much better speechwriter than I am. So George, really quick, in layman's terms for our non-lawyer thinking viewers and myself, what will a national reciprocity bill do for our country and law-abiding citizens who can conceal carry?
Okay. Well, essentially what it will do is to allow someone who has a concealed carry permit from one state to go to any other state in the Union and carry their firearm, subject to, of course, obeying the laws of the state that they're going to.
Okay. Well, I think that was very well put out. Greg, is there a general consensus among the Log Cabin Republicans and this national reciprocity bill or national reciprocity measure?
Not just consensus, it's something that we've supported. We've actually worked with Senator Thune's office on this very legislation. And it's important to point out, I guess for those folks who might be watching tonight on Facebook Live who aren't familiar with Log Cabin Republicans, Log Cabin Republicans is the country's organization representing LGBT conservatives, and I would also add straight conservative allies of the LGBT community. And we have a unique voice that we bring to the table on these issues, supporting not only the Second Amendment, but making a unique conservative case as LGBT Republicans for things like concealed carry reciprocity and for things like preservation of our Second Amendment constitutional rights in general. I mean, within the LGBT community, here you have a cohort that is quantifiably more likely to experience violence, simply being targeted because of who we are or who we love. And in my personal estimation, the estimation of members that we have around the country, the best way to stop a would-be homophobe from committing any sort of anti-LGBT hate crime is to deter that person from even thinking about committing that crime in the first place. And we have statistical evidence where violence is lowered in those parts of the country where people are able to exercise their Second Amendment rights.
And you mentioned being targeted for being part of the LGBT community, which leads me into my next question, and you answered it. You know, does the radical left and their gun control grabbing minions, go out of their way to target, members of the Log Cabin Republicans or conservative LGBT people, and why do you think that they do that?
Well, it's very simple. It's because, the liberal worldview today is that unless you adhere to every tenet of their orthodoxy, you are de facto an enemy of Americans. And so if you subscribe to the liberal orthodoxy, you generally support things like same-sex marriage and marriage equality. That's a good thing. But you also de facto then support taking away guns from law-abiding citizens. And I think one of the more interesting cracks to emerge in this liberal worldview over the course of really the last 2 years, and it's kind of sad to say that really what opened people's eyes was the attack in Orlando by a radical Islamic terrorist against the LGBT community at the gay nightclub Pulse. And in the immediate aftermath of that attack, you had gun shops around the country that were hosting free gun safety classes specifically for members of the LGBT community. They were open to everyone, but they were advertised within the LGBT community. Across the country, you have anecdotal instances where folks were expecting 3, 4, 5 people to show up. They had 40 people come to these classes. They had to offer 4, 5, 6, a dozen of these classes in order to meet the demand. So there's an appetite there among the LGBT community for firearm ownership and preventing the liberal overreach that is trying to encroach on that constitutional right.
And I'm glad you were able to say radical Islamic terrorists, because without addressing the problem, you can't fix the problem.
Of course.
And thankfully now we have a president who is able to address it, unlike the disaster we had for the past 8 years under the Obama administration. Now, George, going back to the Orlando club, had they allowed their attendees of the club to conceal carry, I think it was a gun-free zone. You think they could have stopped that shooting?
Well, across the nation, when there is an armed individual at these mass murder situations, they stop. They do stop them. Basically, whenever there is a mass shooter, the first armed resistance that gets there, whether it's a concealed carrier, whether it's responding police, whether it's an off-duty police officer, they either give up or they kill themselves.
Right. Oh, and they kill themselves. They're cowards. Clearly, they know what's going to come, so they'd rather just end it there and then.
Well, they're cowards to begin with because they're targeting people who generally can't fight back. They pick gun-free zones. Look at the places where these attacks happen. At Sandy Hook, in a movie theater that had a no-gun sign. They pick these places because they want the highest body count that they can get, and the only way they can get that is if they pick a location where they know people are unlikely to be armed.
Now, my question is, we have a horrific shooting like this, whether it be, Orlando, it be Sandy Hook, it be the movie theater, anywhere it's at. Why is it that when something like this happens, the radical left and the gun-grabbing, minions of their will, why do they go after law-abiding gun owners like us three or whoever, and they personally attack us, and then what they do is they use the tragedy of the deaths of our fellow Americans and try to raise money off of it? I mean, so two-part question.
So they dance in the blood.
It's a good way to put it. Would you say?
There is, every time there's one of these tragedies occurs, the liberal misunderstanding of the Constitution, currently existing firearms laws, and currently existing firearms regulations are always brought to light. And you have individuals who do not know what they're talking about when it comes to gun laws, when it comes to current regulations on the left, that are, if not put on television to represent what it means, what the Second Amendment means, are pushing out misinformation to their millions upon millions of Twitter followers.
Fake news.
And so it's certainly frivolous news, right? And it is putting out misinformation out there when, I think a lot of certainly conservatives have it right, where we do have laws on the books. There might be ways that we can more aggressively enforce the laws that already exist without encroaching upon the constitutional right to keep and bear arms that our founding fathers gave us as a matter of principle when this country was founded.
Basically, they want to attack the tool instead of the people who are abusing the tool.
What was it? It's people kill people, not guns kill people, right? And if they could understand that better, that it takes a sick person to go out there and kill innocent Americans, then maybe they would be less willing to attack law-abiding gun owners. I mean, it is their agenda, though, to take away our guns in the end, or even restrict the Second Amendment as much as possible.
Absolutely.
To repeal the Second Amendment. I mean, this is something that is it is the stated agenda of a number of liberals out there right now. It's not quite, I don't believe it's in the Democratic Party's platform yet, but it's certainly the way the winds are blowing on their side of the aisle.
What was the saying? To control people, you must first disarm them? Who said that quote? I know it's a pretty wide use quote.
It's pertinent, and it brings up an interesting point. So, if I can maybe dovetail onto what you're talking about there. When you talk about specifically members of the LGBT community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, who are attacked, targeted because of who they are, for what we call hate crimes, people who are targeted just for that reason and that reason alone because they're different. There is a prevalence of thinking that you can get away with attacking someone who's part of the LGBT community because they are unable to defend themselves. We have this stereotype out there that LGBT individuals are effeminate, unable to fight back, unable to defend ourselves, and certainly unable to shoot a gun.
Which is total
right?
BS.
And it is absolute BS. But again, if we're able to create a climate in the United States where that perception, that stereotype is absolutely shattered, where people understand or come to the conclusion that LGBT individuals are just as able to defend themselves, if not better to defend ourselves, than our straight counterparts, you will see a drop in hate crimes attacks, I guarantee you.
And one person in particular that comes to mind who does that very well is Gina Roberts from the San Diego
Log Cabin Republicans of San Diego president.
Correct.
That's right.
And she just did an interview, over 1 million views. I don't know if you've seen it, George, but I've certainly sent you the link. And she says, she refuses to let herself be a victim. And, part of what she's doing with that is she's a huge Second Amendment advocate, and she's showing the world that, the LGBTQ community is not afraid to pick up a gun and defend themselves. And they want to get rid of the stereotype that they are victims. And another follow-up question is, when someone attacks a person, LGBT community on the right, on the conservative side, it's okay. But if you go after someone of that community on the left, then you're homophobe or transphobic or one of the above.
I'm not quite getting what you're...
So it's okay when people attack the LGBT community for the members on the right side of the aisle, so for conservative LGBT members.
Totally. And just kind of bring it back to what we're talking about today. I mean, one of the more interesting and to me one of the more exciting memes to emerge in the fall of 2016, when you had, again, in the sad aftermath of that attack in Orlando, was the LGBT community, certainly a segment of the LGBT community, rising to arms. And you had this meme that went out that was a Gadsden flag that was painted in rainbow colors, and it said, "Don't tread on me," #shoot back, right?
Yes.
And you had the shoot back meme that was emerging, and I wouldn't even say it was something that was partisan. It was just something that sprung up organically with members of the LGBT community that felt that, maybe were in some cases for the first time in their lives aware of their ability, or as George would know in some states, lack of ability to legally purchase and own a firearm, who were being demonized by the left simply because they wanted to exercise their constitutional rights. And instead of championing the fact that there's at the very least diversity of thought on these matters within the LGBT community, there's Republicans, there's Democrats, there's supporters of the Second Amendment within the LGBT community. A lot of my friends and colleagues were being labeled gun nuts, right? Just because they were, again, exercising their constitutional rights and labeled gun nuts by the LGBT left. Right? So for them, it is not a matter of encouraging diversity of thought. It's not even a matter of guaranteeing our constitutional rights. It's a matter of groupthink and adhering to their orthodoxy. When it comes to Second Amendment or whatever is in the entire liberal litany that comes with being part and party to the Democratic establishment.
Now, one group that I remember specifically that came up very strong voiced after the Orlando shooting were the group Pink Pistols. And George, I don't know if you worked with them at all, and especially here in D.C. Have you at all?
Well, they were plaintiffs in the case that brought about shall issue concealed carry in D.C. I want to make one point about the Orlando Pulse shooting. It took police approximately an hour before they could go in and neutralize the subject. Think about how many lives would have been saved if some person in the first couple of minutes of that shooting had been able to bring a firearm to bear and take out the murderer.
Well, we see these happening across the country in gun-free zones. You would think that people who own these locations that are gun-free zones would pick up on the fact that this is where these shootings are happening. So why aren't they?
I think that there is a big case of denial, that they think that if they put a sign that says no guns, that they're not going to have any liability of somebody coming in and having an accidental shooting. But the fact is, what they do by that is they create essentially a fertile killing ground for psychopathic killers. It's, to me, it's very perverse. But people either have been made afraid of legal liability, or they conscientiously object to the idea of self-defense, or they've just fallen for the liberal Kool-Aid.
Good, Gregory.
Yeah, there's two I think what's at the core of all of this is that there are two very different philosophical perspectives when it comes to what firearms represent to the left and what firearms represent to the right. On the right, I don't know about you, I'll just speak for myself. I will look at a firearm and I see, all right, there's a tool that I can use for self-defense and that can protect me, can protect my family, my loved ones, my possessions. The left will look at a firearm and say, this is a killing machine, something that needs to be banned, and something whose sole purpose is to commit crimes.
A weapon of war.
A weapon of war, that's right. And so as a result, when you have these two very different worldviews on what a firearm's purpose is,
right.
The logical conclusion on the left is that if you put signs out saying this is a gun-free zone, it's a way for them to prevent any sort of crimes or bad actions using firearms from taking place, where I will look at signs like that, depending upon where the venue is, and say, oh, there's a chance I might actually be less safe here as a result of this self-imposed ban. Yeah.
Well, it comes down to also, what is your life worth? Are you willing to risk breaking the law so that you can defend yourself with a firearm if it comes to it? I don't know from a legal perspective, you can't give that advice, but to me personally, if a sign says, it's a gun-free zone, no firearms allowed, am I going to let that put my life at risk just for a sign? I mean, if you're properly concealed carrying, they're not going to know. But
as Tom Gibbons, a noted firearms trainer, says, my gun can't read signs.
Well, and you can always get into signage issues and whatnot. I know a few universities in Texas that I've been working with have signage issues. But going to universities, do you find a strong presence of conservative LGBT students on these college campuses, because they are controlled by the radical left and they are being, brainwashed by them? Do you find that students of the LGBT communities on college campuses are more, gun-friendly, or if they're more, pro-gun control?
Totally the latter. I mean, I will say, and shout out to the brave LGBT conservatives on college campuses these days, because it can be very difficult, right? Especially now, where, let's just take LGBT out of the equation. We do have members in Log Cabin Republicans. We actually have a chapter at UC Berkeley in California. You can imagine that's
brave
kind of
souls.
A blast. That very brave souls.
They need protection.
But but this isn't even a joke. It's not something even to laugh about, because events that our UC Berkeley chapter has partnered with just the general college Republicans group on campus, they faced actual violence. People were taking the display tables they had set up, just saying, sign up for the college Republicans, and upending them, destroying them, throwing them in the trash, letting them know that even their thought is not welcome on the college campus. So, Tyler, I know you did some yeoman's work establishing students for the Second Amendment at the University of Delaware. And so, it can be difficult enough to be conservative on a college campus these days. It's probably even more difficult to be an LGBT conservative on a college campus these days. And it's probably really difficult to be an LGBT conservative who's openly supporting the Second Amendment on a college campus these days. But how absurd is that? It's controversial today in 2017 to be a member of the LGBT community who supports the Constitution. That really, this may be for a discussion for a different day here, but it tells us something about the current climate today.
Some of these students live in such a reality, a fake world that they think it revolves around them and their safe spaces. And if students have constitutional rights, and George, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but some of these universities, public universities that have to abide by state law because they are state funded, they can choose which amendments to abide by. So students have a First Amendment right, they have a First Amendment right, a Fourth Amendment right if they live on campus, but no Second Amendment right. When it comes to that, it's non-existent. How can these schools arbitrarily choose which amendments to follow, which ones to not follow?
Well, the courts have been very solicitous of regulations involving firearms and colleges and universities. So they've generally allowed them to restrict firearms on campuses. Now, some states have legislatively decided that they don't want to go that way. Colorado, for years, has all their public colleges have they've been able to have guns there. Texas just recently enacted carry on campus, and Utah has had it for a very long time. Okay. And all of the house of uglies that the left has said will happen if we allow guns on campus doesn't happen there. But the hue and cry that happens when there are legislative proposals to relax the laws against carrying on campus is just huge.
Okay. And you mentioned University of Delaware and Students for the Second Amendment. When I was there, and this is going back to the LGBT students from the left, I reached out to their LGBT group on campus, which I won't name, and I said, hey, would you guys be interested in partnering and doing an event? And the president then of the group, who was a good friend, said that his board unanimously agreed that he want nothing to do with us because we have nothing to do with them, which makes absolutely no sense. Here we are, a pro-self-defense organization wanting to work with the LGBT community on campus, and they want nothing to do with it.
Yeah, and that also really betrays a political ideology over any sort of support for people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. And if I'm taking off my partisan hat for a moment, I think it's one of the more interesting developments that I've seen over the course of the last 2-3 months is there is a group called Triggered, which is a bunch of queer individuals on the left who identify themselves as part of the hashtag resistance
do they all wear
movement or whatever.
Pins?
But they might well do that. But they are finding a reason to exercise their Second Amendment protection. So their Second Amendment constitutional right, I should say. So I guess the point is that there are supportive voices already existent within the LGBT community. They're on both the left and the right, okay. and in fact emerging voices on the left. And they too are being shunned by their liberal colleagues, not even counterparts, because support for the Second Amendment is not part of the left's agenda. And it doesn't matter if you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, straight, queer, whatever the heck you identify as. If you support the Second Amendment, they won't support you.
Which is absolutely absurd because it's the right to defend ourselves. Get to our last question here real quick. So let's say national reciprocity is passed. So first,
plainly, travelers will be expected to know the laws. The extent to which states will inform, will they have websites where you can look up the law? I think probably most states do. I don't know that there's going to be any mechanism where they can specifically target concealed carriers who might travel to their state. I think it is incumbent upon anyone who travels with a firearm to know the laws of the states that they're going to.
Okay. Sounds good to me. So basically what you're saying is, if, let's say I travel to a state, concealed carrying, I don't know the law, I break the law, there's no, get out of free jail card, you're going to jail.
I don't know that you're going to jail, but you may very well be arrested and prosecuted. Again, most of these firearm laws are status offenses, so the likelihood that someone who is not a real danger is going to do serious jail time, with the exception of the state of New Jersey or New York or California or Hawaii, is limited. But who wants to get arrested when they can avoid it by just checking the law of the state that they're going to?
Exactly.
That's what I would call common sense gun safety.
Common sense gun safety.
Like a good lawyer.
Not common sense gun control, common self gun safety. Big difference. And then, real quick for you, Gregory. So let's say this national reciprocity does get passed. You think we're going to see a decrease in crime or an increase in crime?
Well, I mean, if you look statistically, you see that the parts of the country where people are allowed the right to concealed carry, and where there's generally a greater prevalence of Second Amendment freedoms as opposed to Second Amendment infringement, you have less violent crime. You have less violent crimes. That's something that cuts across all swaths and demographics. So, I mean, certainly if passed as prologue, that would seem to be the case.
Okay. All right, George, I'm going to give you a couple seconds there to say your words of wisdom to our audience watching tonight.
Sure. The most fundamental of human rights is the right of self-preservation. A firearm is an emergency rescue tool, sort of like a fire extinguisher. You probably don't need a fire extinguisher very often, but when you need it badly.
All right, Gregory, and your words of wisdom for our viewers tonight.
Before we went on Facebook Live tonight, George and I were chatting about where opposition to the Second Amendment and firearms comes from. And I will say, I tip my hat to George, because George's suggestion was, invite more people who are skeptical or even opponents of the Second Amendment to just go to a gun range and spend an afternoon there and learn more about what it actually means to use a firearm. And historically, you will find time and again the people that have a familiarity with firearms, their safe use, and an understanding of how one can legally obtain a firearm become and are supporters of the Second Amendment and supporters of firearms. And this is it's an issue that should be of a special importance to the LGBT community, a community that has every reason to understand the fact that the Constitution already has a mechanism in place, even in the absence of full federal equality for the LGBT community, for us to defend ourselves, our lives, our possessions, and our families. And I encourage the LGBT community to avail ourselves of that right.
Well, Gregory and George, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. If you have any questions, comments, or snide remarks, make sure to send them to us on Facebook or our website on savinglibertyshow.com. Good night, America.